Pediments may be the architectural structure which, for the smallest amount of work in understanding a few key elements about how they're formed and how they look, we can get the best outcome for the accuracy of our drawings. Let's find out. So what is a pediment? A pediment is this triangular shape that often sits above a columned portico or entranceway. It is often grand and imposing and one of the major elements of a facade. Or it can be an important but less imposing element, combined with other architectural ornamentation. And in fact, we see pediments as architectural decorations over windows and in other places in grand architecture. They can be enormous, if not almost the dominant part of an architectural impact, and they can be filled with masses of complex architectural sculptures. Or they can sit on relatively smaller scale buildings and be filled with architectural reliefs of a more symbolic nature. We can look at them from below, viewing up into the underneath at the top, or we can view them from above, looking down, and in each case with a different perspective, having different parts of it visible. But because it is such a significant part of any architectural facade, and it is visually so prominent, it's important that we draw them correctly. And there are some common mistakes that I've noticed that keep appearing when I look at different drawings that I would like to highlight in this video in the interests of more accurate pediments. Let's go. The first common error that I see repeatedly comes from the fact simply that we know too much about pediments. We know that they're a triangle, and over again I see pediments which are drawn as triangles that come to a point on their horizontal corners. And this is not how they usually appear, certainly not in classical architecture. If we look at this corner here, we can see in fact that here we have the base of the pediment, and the triangular side coming down actually meets it somewhat like this. In fact, in this case, there is also a setback that comes down like this. And this is what we usually see. And we can see it here on the Reichstag in Berlin. We can see it here on the corner of the Madeleine. We can see it here at Les Invalides on the front of the Royal Church. And we can see it here on the smaller scale, L'Orangerie, housing Monet's water lily paintings. So that's the first tip. And it's a great illustration of the point that one of our problems in drawing is that we draw what we think we've seen, not what we've actually seen. And so the fact that we think we know what a triangle looks like just encourages us to be a little bit too hasty and not to actually observe that these stacked sides don't come to a point on the horizontal, only at the apex. Our second common mistake in drawing pediments also comes from what we know about them. And what we know about them is that they are isosceles triangles. And if you've forgotten your high school geometry, they're the triangles where two of the sides are of an equal length and their angles are the same as well. And what that means is that where they join is halfway along the third side. So in other words, the point of the top of the pediment is in the center. And that's great when we're drawing a pediment from this viewpoint. If only every pediment was from this angle. But of course that's not the way it works. And this view of the concert hall in Berlin gives us a good example of this. So here we have the base of the pediment and the two sides. Now we know these two sides are equal, but in fact it's quite clear that they are nowhere near equal in this angle. And we also know that if we were to stand down here in the square and look up at this pediment, that this apex would be in the center of this side. It would square up exactly with the midpoint of this center window. And yet, even following the perspective distortion from the camera, we can see in fact that this apex is nowhere near the center. And in fact, if we just take it straight down to the base of the pediment, even following that same angle, difference between the base of the pediment on each side is even more pronounced. Now that's because this pediment to some degree actually overhangs this facade. So the fact that we know the apex of the pediment is centered over its base can actually mislead us to place it in the wrong place. Again, the important thing is that we actually carefully observe the particular pediment that we're drawing and the particular angle we're drawing it from, and make reference to what it aligns with in what we've already drawn. If we've drawn the building below the pediment first, then we can align this with the windows below. If we're drawing the pediment first, then we need to align the apex with the sides and get that sense of proportion correct. The third common mistake I often see in pediments is that the pitch of the sides is wrong. And by that, I simply mean the angle of the sides. Architects take several factors into consideration when they design the angle of pitch on their pediments. Of course, there's the overall scale of the architecture and the way in which the pediment fits into the total picture. And there are also some practical considerations, such as, are there lots of sculptures that need to fit into the pediment, or will the decoration allow more flexibility with the pitch? But some pitches are relatively low, such as this one, whereas others are higher. Now, if we assume the architects actually designed the most aesthetically pleasing pitch for the overall design of the building and the elements that had to sit within the pediment, then we can also assume that if we draw a different pitch, it just won't look quite as good. So we're not looking to draw any triangle. We're looking to draw the triangle that we actually see in our reference building. The fourth mistake that I commonly see in drawings of pediments is that there is no allowance for depth in the pediment. Now, some pediments are relatively shallow, but the grander the building, the more likely the pediment is to have greater depth. It's helpful to think of pediments as picture frames for the sculptures, very deep frames often, as we can see from this pediment from the Richelieu Pavilion at the Musée du Louvre. And there are just a few things we need to note about how this depth is best drawn from this sort of perspective. And now here's the important bit. Again, now this line doesn't go straight back, but it does go back at an angle. And the important thing is that we notice that because of the angle we're looking at, we see more of it here than here. So here we have the depth in our pediment. And so it's within this space that our sculptures sit. So observing this depth in our pediment and making sure we draw just enough lines to capture the sense of it is important. And the fifth mistake I see in pediments is actually in drawing the architectural elements that sit inside of it. I appreciate that for most people who draw architecture, figure drawing is not their strongest subject matter. And the problem is that we see these figures and we try to draw figures. And what usually happens is we get tangled up drawing arms and legs and noses and eyes and lips and hair and hands and feet. And because therefore we have figures that aren't as well drawn as our architecture, they draw unwelcome attention to themselves. And again, the core of this problem is that we haven't really observed our reference closely enough. We look at the figure and we think, oh, I know what a figure looks like. And then we're drawing something that's different to what's really there. And so my advice, and the technique which I developed, because drawing figures has always been a huge weakness of mine, I've always done my best not to see them as figures, but simply to see them as shapes, and particularly the negative spaces, particularly the shapes of the shadows. And I usually try to draw the shapes of the shadows just as much, if not sometimes more, than I actually draw the shapes. And I don't think of figures. I look at lines that come from the same point or go to the same point. Because if I think of them as figures, I'm tempted just to start drawing figures. If I'm thinking of them as a random collection of shapes and lines and shadows, then it forces me to look carefully, and I find it works much better. It does depend a bit on the scale of the drawing, but you can see here there really is just very much the suggestion of the figures, and yet it blends in nicely and doesn't detract from the overall architecture. And it's the same in these larger figures here. I have not tried to draw figures. I've looked at where elbows and knees and waists are and just connected them with lines. And when the view is even more distant, there is even less connection with drawing figures. I'm wanting to suggest the dominant line directions and shadows and silhouettes that we see. Very little is actually drawn. The tip is to suggest what's there, and particularly for subjects such as this, on a scale such as this, I find this works particularly well. In this example, the important thing is to locate the heads the correct distance from each other, and then these shapes of the deep shadows between the figures, which are usually the darker shadows, to get these shapes correct, because they will suggest the shoulders and other elements such perhaps as wings and certainly of heads that we want. And then in this particular scene, the important thing was to get these lines that indicate a knee drawn. And the key thing is to get them at the right scale and in the right position to match up with our heads. And really the principle is no different on these figures up here either. I draw the head, I position the waist, I make sure I've got where the feet are going to go, and I would do a few key lines that suggest the flow of the drapery, and then I take care with the silhouette to get whatever silhouette is on my reference. At no point am I trying to draw the figure of a man in a robe. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Pediments can be a lot of fun, and they're such a defining element in an architectural scene. Let's do our best to have them looking really sharp. And if you're still thinking about that last point about drawing the figures, which I actually think is probably the most important point, not just in this video, but perhaps in all of my videos, go back and look at that very first intro clip again, where I'm actually drawing the figures, because you'll see me put into practice there what I talked about in point number 5. Sorry about that slide in paper. And if you'd like to think about that 5th point more, I do have a whole video on drawing architectural sculptures that you might like to look up. I will put a few of my pediment photos onto my community page if you'd like to have some practice yourself. So have fun. I'll see you next time.